Okay, good morning, everybody. Today is November 5th, and let's keep rolling. I want to remind everyone that Quiz 5 has now opened. You should be taking Quiz 5. You have to take it by Sunday night at 8. And, of course, the discussions 9 and 10, are due by tomorrow, Friday at 8 o'clock. If you have any questions at all, please get in touch with me. Also, I want to remind everybody we are now doing advisement and registration. So get in touch with your advisor. Today and tomorrow, we're actually having advisement in the Commons if you want to come in physically and talk to somebody. And if you don't know who your advisor is, or if you have any questions about that process, get in touch with me. I'll be happy to point you in the right direction. But what matters is I want you to get into your spring classes. I want everybody to get that taken care of. Get into your classes before they fill up. We all know why that's important. Okay, when we left off, we were talking about these various reform groups that sort of pop up as a result of the growth of cities. And we talked about temperance, the anti-alcohol movement. We talked about the push for public education. We talked about the push to address issues of mental health and prostitution and prisons. We also talked about the emerging women's rights movement. Now, we're not done with this, of course. We're not finished here. Did we talk about women's rights? Did we get there? I'm not sure we did. Not really. Yeah, we didn't really get there. So let's mention that real quick. And this is obviously a very big one, and we will revisit it, particularly next semester. But beginning in the middle of the 19th century, we are going to start seeing a group of reformers move forward, pushing for a change in the traditional social fabric of the country. The traditional men's and women's roles, they argue, have not been particularly fair to women. And so they're going to start pushing for changes as far as that goes. The leaders of these movements, there's quite a few of them, but two that stand out. One is a woman by the name of Susan B. Anthony. And the other is Elizabeth Stanton. And like so many other sort of teams, one kind of tends to be forgotten. Susan B. Anthony is now the only one that is really remembered of the two. Elizabeth Stanton's kind of the Garfunkel of the two. But nonetheless, they were both kind of equal and significant here. And what they're calling for are changes in rules involving women's education. They want women to go to school longer. Changes in rules regarding female employment. They want women to be able to work outside of the home in positions that are significant, positions of authority. Plenty of women are working outside the homes, just look at the factories, but none of these women seem to be moving up into the ranks of the management, if you will. They want to see women have better rights in the cases of divorce. During this era, if women get divorced, they typically would lose custody of their children and would often just simply be out on the street, and they want to see an end to that. A whole series of issues are concerning to them, and we'll get to the big one in a minute. And in 1848, the first women's convention met at Seneca Falls, New York. Now, you will recall I mentioned all along the Erie Canal in upper New York, there's all kinds of activity going on. And this is an example of that. Seneca Falls is in upper New York. And at this convention, they put together a declaration of sentiments calling for a series of social and legal changes that they asserted would be beneficial to women and thus beneficial to all of society. And the changes that I mentioned before were a key part of this, but the ultimate goal was giving women the right to vote, female suffrage. At this time, very few states permitted women to vote. Women didn't vote, and women did not hold public office. Now, keep in mind, again, we just had an election, so it's important that we remember this stuff. The federal government doesn't regulate how elections are held. Each state comes up with their own rules. So states will determine how old you are when you vote. States will determine property requirements. Most of that is gone now, although you still would have to be 21 in most states. Now it's 18. And the states, for the most part, did not permit women to vote. Only men could vote. And so what they're wanting is for the states to reform this. And they either want the states to do this individually, or they're going to want a constitutional amendment requiring it. And that's what would eventually happen. Now, the Seneca Falls Convention is going to expose differences in opinions, although they could all agree that the role of women in society needs to be changed. There's issues that they don't necessarily agree on. For example, a lot of them are also temperance advocates. They don't want to see alcohol in society. Some of them don't see that as a particularly important issue. Some are civil rights advocates. Some are pushing for an end to slavery, and they see the oppression of women as very similar to the oppression of non-whites, and they argue that this is actually sort of a similar issue. And so abolitionists were there. Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist, was a big part of this convention, for example. But other women's rights advocates are arguing that these issues need to be separated. And it gets even more complicated because some would advocate, for example, for abolition, but they'll argue we shouldn't support it because we're not going to get what we want if we try to throw abolition in there as well. And so if we only focus on the rights of women but don't care about the rights of blacks and non-whites, we're much more likely to win, if you will. So there's all kinds of debate going on with that. And we also have to keep in mind, and I really mean this, and we'll get to this later, but what role the genders are going to play in society is more complicated than just simply saying, let's make everybody equal. That's the easy part, and that's something that we should all agree on. But exactly why women were not necessarily permitted to vote is, for lack of a better description, more complicated than just men wanting to keep women down. Because the argument there would be, if we allow women to vote, would we also require women to, for example, participate in military service? Because when a war happens and we draft all of the men to go fight and die, well, you know, if we're going to say women are equal, well, does that mean that women have to go do the same thing, right? That's the kind of issue that we would also have to deal with. Also, and I know this gets a little bit weird, but just bear with me here. We don't have a secret ballot in this country. I think I've already gone into that, right? You know, a secret ballot was seen as very anti-American because if you are forced to hide your vote, then something has definitely gone off the rails. A free society is a society where people should be comfortable expressing their political opinions without fear of repercussion. Well, in a married couple, if we don't have a secret ballot, a wife is likely to be told how to vote by her husband. As a matter of fact, in a lot of states, there's a law in the books that require women to obey their husbands, as ridiculous as that sounds. So in a society where we have no secret ballots, allowing women to vote doesn't really give women the right to vote. All it does is give husbands a second vote. You see what I'm saying? So single women would get to vote, but married women would simply vote their husbands. Now, it gets even more complicated than that because we can fix that real easy. Don't make women obey their husbands. Problem solved, right? Hey, I can see that. Here's the trick, though. There is now going to be the argument that creating that level of equality, telling women you can get an education, you can live your own life, you can make your own decisions, you don't have to obey your husband, et cetera, is probably going to lead to a large spike in the divorce rate. It's probably going to lead to a large spike in promiscuous activity, irresponsible sexual activity, children being born out of wedlock. And so, to a certain degree, the anti-Seneca Falls folks are going to argue that in order to preserve the nuclear family, in order to preserve a man and a wife staying married and focusing on the well-being of their children, we kind of need to keep things as they are. Because the minute you tell women, go out and get your own job, go out and earn your own money, go out and vote your own mind, go out and live your life on your terms, is the minute men are going to start dumping their wives and women are going to start walking away from their husbands. And the person that suffers there are the kids. You know, those are the people that suffer from that. And so it gets a lot more complicated than just simply saying, let's let women vote. Obviously, again, it's a good thing today, and we're glad we did. Equality has to happen. Equality has to be universal. We just have to ask ourselves, why did so many women oppose this? You know, and why was this such a controversial issue? Why can't we just obviously say, let's make everybody equal? We're going to have to work through this as a society. We've got to debate this. And we're going to discuss it even more once we get next semester. So there we go. And the one thing I absolutely want to make sure is that, you know, all of you ladies vote, right? I mean, there was an awful lot of work put out there to give you the right to do that. So by all means, exercise it. Everybody, go out and vote. Register, vote, express your opinion. and keep college tuition low, because when young people vote, the legislature listens, and that means lower tuition for you, and I think that's a good thing. Anyway, let's talk about some other reformers. I want to talk about some religious groups. And I'm only going to mention a couple of them very quickly because I do want to move on. We've got to get our manifest destiny underway. But one interesting religious group, and we'll put them in the reformers, are the Shakers. This is a very unique American group. They were actually founded in 1774 by a woman named Ann Lee. And this is going to be one of several, what I guess we will call quasi-Christian groups. Groups that identify as Christian, that follow Christian doctrine, but not in a traditional sense, that add to or in some way modify Christian scripture in a way that sort of kind of puts it in a gray area. And the Shakers fall into this group. Ann Lee, the founder of the Shakers, claimed that she was Jesus. She was a reincarnated Jesus. And so right away, Christians would say, hold on a minute, this isn't quite Christian. And she argued that she was going to create a pure society that would not include everyone. And these people would become collectively known as the Shakers. And they formed their own villages and their own communes all throughout the country, generally north of the Ohio River. States like Ohio, Indiana, Michigan New York had large Shaker communities. They lived among themselves. They did not live in separate families. It was like a big campus, and they all lived together. Here's where it gets very interesting. They had music and culture and their own identity, and they absolutely believed that Mother Lee was the reincarnated Jesus. One of the rules to being a Shaker is that marriage and sex were strictly prohibited among everybody. You cannot have a partner, and absolutely no giggity, giggity, or giggity. So there you go. And the big question is, why on earth would they do this? This sounds pretty crazy. That was her way of saying we're going to live in a pure society. She argued that all sexual activity is evil, and the only way to be pure is to completely cut yourself off from it. So then the question is, well, all right, how are we going to have new Shakers? You know, if we're not getting together, where do the babies come from? Where does the next generation of Shakers emerge? The Shakers firmly believed that everybody would not be a Shaker. And what they would do is they would recruit from the outside. You know, anybody is welcome to join as long as you play by our rules. And they also adopted a lot of children. And of course, this is an era where a lot of people die young, so there's a lot more children without parents. And so orphans were frequently brought into Shaker communities. Now, as odd as it sounds, for a long time, particularly in the 19th century, Shaker culture was quite successful. They were known in their communities as, you know, good people. They worked very hard. They obeyed the law. They were charitable. They were very, very industrious. Form follows function. Everything's got to work. Everything's got to be, you know, usable was the way the Shakers work. And all kinds of interesting American inventions were Shakers. For example, they invented the rocking chair. They invented the circular saw. They invented the clothespin. All kinds of neat little American inventions were Shakers. Yeah, the rocking chair that we're all familiar with. That's a Shaker invention. They invented it. I guess the men were such hard work. I guess they were frustrated, right? You know, all these women are around and I can't do anything, so I'm going to go to work in the wood shop, I guess. Heck, I don't know. But anyway, they also came up with a lot of songs. A lot of American folk songs are actually Shaker songs. We just don't know that, but I could play a whole bunch of different Shaker songs for you, and you would recognize a lot of them from the kind of stuff we sing in elementary school and whatever. The Shakers declined in the 20th century. The notion that you can't get married and have children obviously isn't going to appeal to everybody, and as the 20th century moves in, their numbers continue to decline. And by the 1950s, there really weren't that many left. There were a few communities around, but not many of them. And in the 1960s, the federal government made it illegal for organizations to adopt children. You know, groups can no longer adopt children anymore. Only individual families can. And so the Shakers couldn't adopt anymore, and that was kind of it for them. I think there actually are like 3 or 4 people still alive that call themselves Shakers, but that's kind of it. Another group are the Millerites, and I'm only going to mention them very quickly. The Millerites argued that the second coming would happen any day now, and they kind of grew. They initially argued that it would happen in October of 1843, but then when it didn't happen, they came up with another date and another date. And they argued sort of different sort of quasi-Christian beliefs. Today, the Millerites are known as the Seventh-day Adventists. If you've heard of that group, they come from the Millerites. Another group of the Jehovah's Witnesses is another uniquely American movement that comes out of this. And the one that we really need to mention, though, are the Mormons. And again, I want to move quickly because this really wasn't what I wanted to focus on today. But that's all right. Now, the Mormons are not officially known as Mormons. That's a nickname. They are officially known as the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And they were founded by a fellow named Joseph Smith. Now, bear with me. We're going to move very quickly because, again, I want to move on to something else, but I just kind of want to lay the foundation here. Joseph Smith was from Upper New York. He was from Palmyra, New York, specifically, along the Erie Canal. A lot's happening up there, and he was up there. And in the 1820s, Smith began to argue that he had found a series of golden tablets buried in the ground, that he had had a vision, actually, and he had been led. Siri is talking to me. Got to watch what I say here. My iPhone kicks in. Smith argued that he had been led to a collection of golden tablets that had been buried in the ground, and that on these tablets was a script, was writing that was some ancient language that couldn't be read, but that there was also some special seer stones that enabled him to translate it. So he wrote down what these golden tablets had on them, and that this was, in fact, the third book of the Bible. We have the Old Testament, we have the New Testament, and we have this third book from these golden tablets, which Smith called the Book of Mormon. I won't write it down. So there is a third book of the Bible according to Smith, the Book of Mormon. And this Book of Mormon has a whole additional set of teachings and events that happened in North America. And the short answer is that after Christ's crucifixion, he came to North America and had more interactions with Native Americans, etc. Now, I'm not getting into the theology here. Well, Smith began to gain followers in the 1830s, and the Mormon Church, as it would be nicknamed, began to grow. There was one element about this, though, that made them controversial. Obviously, this is the United States. We have freedom of religion, worship whoever you want. But Smith argued that there are, in fact, more than one version of heaven. There's more than one version of heaven. And the highest level of heaven can only be reached if you take up more than one wife. That men are expected to have at least 4 wives, and that, of course, is encouraged. And Joseph Smith himself had many more wives than that. And so he is advocating plural marriage. And this was sort of a fundamental belief that Joseph Smith preached. And that, of course, makes it controversial. Eventually, they were left/run out of New York, where they went to Illinois. But once in Illinois, again, they angered the local population largely because of this practice of polygamy. Again, you can worship however you want. I mean, you can believe there's a third book of the Bible. That's not bothering anybody so much. But when you start taking more than one wife, that's where communities would draw the line. And in 1844, Smith was arrested and died in jail. He was shot, and the circumstances surrounding it are subject to debate. Some argued that he was just shot by the sheriff. Others say that he snuck a gun in and tried to shoot his way out. Again, nobody really knows. But after Smith died, the Mormons got a new leader, a man by the name of Brigham Young. And Brigham Young concluded that the American people would never accept the Mormon culture. And this practice of having multiple wives is just not going to work. And so he wanted to take the people as far away, his people as far away from American culture as he could, isolate ourselves, And so the Mormons migrated to the Great Salt Lake, which of course is far within the American West. And in 1844 was part of Mexico. So we're leaving the United States, but we're going into a place that basically nobody is, with the exception of Native Americans. So we can practice our culture and practice our religion and marry as many wives as we want, I suppose. Now, once they got there, they figured out that life is really, really, really hard. There was an assumption, of course, the trek there was incredibly difficult. But the assumption was the Great Salt Lake will be a water source where they can grow crops, etc. But what they didn't know was that the Great Salt Lake doesn't work that way. It's salty. It's an inland saltwater sea. So they couldn't use the water once they got there. And that turned out to be a much bigger problem than they had assumed. And so life for these people was very rugged, very hard. I mean, they really had to, eke their way out. And so the survival of the Mormons was a testament to their willingness to really work hard at it. But they built Salt Lake City under Brigham Young's leadership. The federal government pretty much ignored them. You see, in 1846, we went to war with Mexico and got that land back as federal territory. So this idea that we're going to get out of the United States didn't work. But the federal government left them alone pretty much for the next couple of decades because they were a small group, they were isolated, they were way out there, they weren't causing any problems. But they also had a tendency to attack settlers that were going out to California. And there were a few instances where they actually attacked and killed a lot of people because they did not want outside settlers to come in. The Mountain Meadows Massacre, for example, is one of them. And we don't need to get into that, too many details. But eventually, the federal government sent some soldiers to establish federal control, not fight them, but just make sure the Mormons understand you are, in fact, in the United States. You are subject to federal law. And in the 1890s, specifically in 1890, they made a deal with the federal government. They made a deal with the federal government. The Mormon Church would end plural marriage. They would quit marrying multiple women. And in return, they would become a state. And so the state of Utah was created, and the Mormon Church ended the practice of plural marriage. And today, the Mormon Church has nothing to do with plural marriage, just in case you're wondering. They make it extremely clear that they have absolutely no support of it. They don't tolerate discussion of it or anything else. There are a handful of little breakaway groups that live very isolated that still do it, but they're pretty small. Some even fled to Mexico, for example. Some went south of the Rio Grande because they didn't want to play around. They didn't want to play by the new rules, but it was a small little group of people that did that. And so throughout the 20th century, the Mormon Church sort of became more mainstream, if you will, and there you go. And today, of course, the Mormon Church continues to grow. Mormons are everywhere now. I mean, it's not just Utah, although obviously that's sort of ground zero. But the Mormon Church is all around the world now. There's Mormon communities all throughout the U.S. It's a uniquely American religion that has spread throughout the world. Whether or not you consider Mormons Christians, I guess, is up to you. That's not for us to decide. But they do believe there is this third book of the Bible, so you can decide that for yourself. This all sort of became a big issue. I don't want to say a big issue. And again, because of where we are 2 days after a presidential election. 2 cycles ago, in 2012, Mitt Romney was the Republican nominee. And Mitt Romney is a very devout Mormon. I mean, he is not an ordinary Mormon. He's like a super Mormon. He's very, very high up in the church and highly regarded. And he had been the governor of Massachusetts. And so again, Mormons are kind of everywhere now. And so that was the first time that the Mormon church really was on a national stage, because we could have had a Mormon president. He could have been elected. And so, it's just a testament to the fact that the church continues to grow. And again, what you think of the legitimacy of Christianity, if you add a third book, again, that's up to you. You can decide for yourself. I'm not getting into that. Okay, with that in mind, let's move on. Got to get back to politics, and we got to get back to America's westward movement, because there is certainly plenty going on there. If we look at the West, what we need to understand that by the 1840s, most of the territory east of the Mississippi River has now been settled. Most of the territory east of the river has been settled. Now, there's still big, wide open areas. There's plenty of open space in states like, Tennessee and Arkansas and Missouri and, north of the Ohio River, Michigan, and all of that. There's still plenty of land everywhere. But we now have states, we now have governments, we have members going to Congress, we now have communities. The land to the west of the Mississippi is still very much unsettled. As a matter of fact, to a large extent, it is even unexplored. We had long thought that having that land all the way to the Pacific Ocean would benefit the United States. And after the Louisiana Purchase, President Jefferson actually sent an exploratory group to see what was there. And this is known as the Lewis and Clark Expedition. I'm sure you've heard of it. And it went from 1804 to 1806. And it was a couple of dozen rough pioneers that started in St. Louis, Missouri, traveled all the way to the Pacific Ocean in present-day Oregon, turned around and traveled all the way back. And it was an amazing journey, and all kinds of crazy stuff happened to them along the way. St. Louis was seen as the gateway to the West. St. Louis is the difference between the East and the West. And it is on the banks of the Mississippi River in St. Louis that the Lewis and Clark Expedition left. And so that is celebrated today, because what's in St. Louis? It celebrates that movement from the East to the West. Well, what's in St. Louis? I'll give you a hint. It looks like this. It's the arch. Yeah, the St. Louis Arch. It's the doorway. It's the gateway to the West. That's why there's a big arch in St. Louis. And that's what that symbolizes. And theoretically, they don't know for sure, but that arch is located where Lewis and Clark left. Because it's right on the banks of the Mississippi there. And the idea was that was the spot where Lewis and Clark headed out toward the Pacific to explore this unexplored territory, at least for white people. There were other explorations that took place in the West. Zebulon Pike, he went out there in 1806. Another man by the name of Jedediah Smith. He explored the West from 1822 to 1830. Another fellow named Stephen Long. Stephen Long, 1819 to 1820. Also traveled all around the West. The final name I'll give you, I'll write it up here, was a man named John Fremont. And John Fremont explored the West in the 1840s. 1843. And Fremont's going to be a little bit more significant. There we go. Sorry for my handwriting. Because Fremont will enter national politics, and he will become sort of a national figure for a variety of ways, for a variety of reasons. Now, of course, we have to keep in mind that there are plenty of people living in this Western land. Plenty of Native Americans, indigenous people. And this Western land is not all just wide open. A big part of it is part of the Spanish Empire and later part of Mexico. And so it isn't as if a Western power has not even claimed this land, but the United States is looking at this land. They're looking at the Pacific Ocean way out there, and a lot of American leaders are saying that's what we want. We want to have ports on both sides. We want to have the Pacific and we want to have the Atlantic. A new term emerges in 1845, and this term is manifest destiny. And it is a term that defines America's expansion spirit. Manifest destiny, meaning that God has given us the responsibility to spread out, to move west, to continue to take more land and grow our culture. It is the phrase that defines the American spirit during this era. Under the idea of manifest destiny, American culture is superior. The American way of life is the best way of life. Our political system of democracy and constitutional government should expand everywhere. Every culture should be a democracy. Every country should have its own constitution. Everyone should be like us because we're the best. And if you say to yourself, well, it's a good thing we're not like that anymore. Well, of course we're still like that, right? We go into other countries and we try to install democratic governments, right? We try to write constitutions that are very similar to our own. We've decided that every country around the world would be best if they were like us. That concept has never really gone away. It's part of the American identity. That the old world of Europe and absolutism and kings and queens and nobility and serfs and peasants, all of that was archaic, and that the world would be better off once the American example was followed. And we have that right and responsibility to keep moving west. And we don't need to feel guilty about it. Well, this is going to move into politics because this is a politically touchy issue, to say the least. The Democratic Party, the party of Jackson and Jefferson, supported this wholeheartedly. Moving west will help America become an even bigger nation of small farmers. Expanding agriculture is the best part of American culture. Moving west will take the pressure off of growing urban areas. All those immigrants that are coming into the cities, well, they ought to move out to the countryside and get some land and start farming instead. Those Irish and those Italians and those other folks. And again, the German population was immigrating here as well, and they were seen as a good example of this because the Germans tended to want to go into the countryside and farm. The Whigs, on the other hand, tended to oppose westward expansion. The Whigs were not fans of it. Now, I'll just ask you, what are the problems with westward expansion? We can, manifest destiny. Let's, move west and grow American spirit. What are going to be some of the problems here that obviously the Whigs are going to point out? I think you were going to say something. A little louder? And that's the biggest issue here. It's not like this is just open territory where nobody lives, right? First of all, there's Native Americans, right? And although we think, America was racist and wanted to do terrible things to the Indians, the reality behind it is the Whigs did not want conflict with them. And there's all kinds of Native American tribes and cultures west of the Mississippi River that we will almost certainly come into conflict with if we continue to move west. And that's not good for anybody. And so the Whigs argued, leave those Native Americans alone. Let them be themselves. Why should we go through that kind of trouble? The Whigs would also argue that this is going to bring us into conflict with European powers or other Western countries. Obviously, Spain isn't going to give this up, but Mexico becomes independent in 1821, so Mexico would be the nation that we could come in conflict with. This will almost certainly lead to war with Mexico if we start taking territory to the west. A big problem that the Whigs saw with this is that there still is an awful lot of land east of the Mississippi River. America is a huge country, and there is just enormous opportunity where we have already settled. You know, every state has vast amounts of open land that can still be settled, and that land can be bought from the federal government, can't it? And so if these settlers want land, they can buy it from the federal government, giving the U.S. Treasury a boost. It's good for the economy if we sell the land we have. And so the Whigs, again, being economic minded, thought that that was a positive. So let's sell the land we have rather than keep moving west, where we're only going to come into conflict. We don't need that land. I mean, we've got enough land east of the Mississippi River to last us a couple of hundred years. I mean, we can just, generations can continue to settle this land with no problem at all. Now, there's going to be a few overland trails. There's going to be a few overland trails. And I don't have a map here of it, unfortunately. Well, I do. It's kind of on here, though. You can't see it at home, folks. I'm sorry. Maybe what I'll do, I'll just talk about them and find the map later, because I would have to rely on a paper map here, and I don't want to go through that. One trail led to Oregon, the Oregon Territory. And the Oregon Territory is unsettled. You know, nobody is claiming that. Mexico doesn't claim it. The U.S. doesn't claim it. And because of that, everybody seems to claim it. You know, we want it, Britain wants it, Russia actually wants it. So the Oregon Territory is part of this, and there's a trail, the Oregon Trail, as you've probably heard. So already by the 1840s, we're starting to see Americans move into that land. There's also what's known as the Santa Fe Trail, a trade route between Santa Fe, Mexico, and Missouri, or the East. And this was kind of dangerous. You know, it was a trade route where goods were moved back and forth, but Native American tribes like the Apache and the Comanche tended to raid these parties, because that's what happens out there. And that opens the door to Texas. That opens the door to Texas. Now, this map is a little off, so you'll just have to bear with me. Spoiler alert, we win the war. Everybody knows where Texas is. Texas was a Mexican state. It was part of Mexico. But of course, Mexico declares independence in 1821 from Spain. And this territory north and east of the Rio Grande River, also what would be California and the American Southwest, this territory is very sparsely populated by any Mexicans. I mean, there's plenty of Indians out there. The Comanche tribe, for example, is very powerful in Texas, but very little agriculture. The Mexican government doesn't have much to do with it, and the Mexican government wants settlement there. The Mexican government wants growth there. And so in the 1820s, Mexico opened Texas to settlement and openly encouraged Americans to come to Mexico and establish farms. So Americans immediately start pouring into Texas. East Texas has an awful lot of very fertile land. Most of these people, if you look at the geography, it doesn't take a genius to figure out, most of these people are going to come from the South, and their idea is to farm cotton. You know, they want to establish cotton farms. And so they start moving into Texas, and they bring their slaves with them. And that's where the problem starts. Because you see, slavery is illegal in Mexico. And the Mexican people and the Mexican government are very adamant that they do not like it. There is no debate here. Not only is it illegal, but it is morally reprehensible, and they will not permit it in Mexico. So you Americanos can come here, and we'd love for you to become Mexican citizens and grow cotton or whatever you want to grow, contribute, but you can't have slavery. You can't have slavery. That was roundly ignored as more and more settlers are moving into Texas, bringing their slaves with them, and simply ignoring this specific law. By 1828, the Mexican government concluded that it had made a mistake, that Texas is very rapidly becoming a slave territory. It is too far away from Mexico City to effectively enforce this law, and so Mexico closed the border. Mexico decided no more settlement, and of course, still no more slavery. Nothing changed. More and more settlers continue to pour into Texas. More and more continue to bring slaves with them. Open border or closed border, it doesn't matter. And yes, there is absolutely plenty of joking that we could make today with all these Americans trying to get into Mexico, right? Close the border. Maybe they should have built a wall, right? And America's going to pay for it. Yeah. Anyway, the dictator of Mexico, and that's what he wasn't exactly democratically elected, was a man with a bit of an ego, Antonio de Padua Maria Servino Lopez de Santa Ana y Perez de Lebrón. You need to know that for the test, everybody. And spelling is right. Or you can just call him Santa Anna. That would be fine with me. Okay. You got to have that fancy long name if you're going to be a Latin American dictator, I suppose. Anyway, Santa Anna wanted to clarify the Texas situation. Santa Anna considered himself the Napoleon of the West. He had a huge ego. His hold on the Mexican government was tenuous, and so he made an issue out of Texas. And he demanded that Texas end slavery, across the board, and made it clear that he is going to send in the Mexican authorities to make sure that this is the case. And it's important to keep in mind, Texas is part of Mexico. Texas is not the United States. So when these Americans moved into Texas, they were getting rid of their American citizenship and taking up citizenship in Mexico. And Mexican law was very clear. They were Mexican citizens. They cannot have slaves. Well, fast forwarding to keep it simple, in 1835, rather than comply with Santa Anna's orders, Texas simply declared itself independent. These Texans really had no intention of ever being part of Mexico. Their goal is to embrace manifest destiny, let Texas become part of the United States. There had already been plenty of talk into the United States of trying to acquire Texas from Mexico peacefully, talks of buying Texas, buying Western land, et cetera, et cetera. But of course, Mexico wanted nothing to do with that. When Texas declared independence, they declared themselves the Republic of Texas. This movement was led by a man named Stephen F. Austin and Sam Houston, two men. Stephen F. Austin and Sam Houston were sort of the two men that spearheaded Texas independence. And now Santa Anna has an excuse to send the army. So Santa Anna organizes an army of several thousand Mexican soldiers to invade and put down this rebellion. In the spring of 1836, more specifically, March of 1836, a little over 100 Texans had walled themselves in San Antonio in a former mission known as the Alamo, It used to be a Spanish mission. Santa Anna and his men surrounded the Alamo and after a brief siege, stormed it and killed everyone inside. And the last few Texans surrendered and Santa Anna executed them. So now the Alamo is a rallying cry. Santa Anna has become a war criminal. There was another massacre known as the Goliad Massacre, where several hundred Texans surrendered to Santa Anna, and he had all of them executed too, which just fired up the Texas people. And at this point, people in the United States are supporting Texas. You know, there's a huge movement within the United States to stand with the people of Texas in their fight against tyranny, which, if you really think about it, was a fight to keep slavery. You know, that was the root of the problem to begin with. On April 21st, Sam Houston defeated Santa Anna at the Battle of San Jacinto. A few weeks later, Sam Houston and an outnumbered group of Texans led a surprise attack on Santa Anna and beat him at the Battle of San Jacinto. So Santa Anna is now a captive of Sam Houston. And what Sam Houston did was, I don't know if this is exactly how it happened, but this was the idea. He hung a noose around a tree. He looked at Santa Anna and said, either you agree to Texas independence or I'm going to hang you right here and now. And so Santa Anna, not having a choice, signed a document recognizing Texas as an independent country and packed up and went back home to Mexico. Now, here's the problem with that. What Sam Houston did was illegal. And any treaty signed under duress is not a valid treaty. A man who signs a treaty upon the pain of death did not voluntarily do so. And so the treaty acknowledging Texas independence was not internationally recognized. But I can assure you the Texans did not care. Texas is now an independent country. Santa Anna goes back to Mexico City. He does not recognize Texas. He insists that that was an illegal document that he signed, and he was right about that. Insisted that Texas will remain part of Mexico and that this is not over. So now we've got a real conflict here. Texas is an independent country. Mexico is refusing to recognize it. What does the United States do? Are y'all following me? Well, the United States recognizes Texas independence. The United States decides, yes, Texas is an independent country, and diplomatic relations were established, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I'll ask you, what do the people of Texas really want? I mean, if you go to Sam Houston or you go to the rest of the people of Texas and say, congratulations, you're your own country and the United States has recognized you, what's going to be their real answer? How about we not be our own country anymore and let's join the United States, right? That's what they want. Texas wants to be annexed by the United States and become part of the USA. Now, all of a sudden, we now have a debate. Beginning in 1836, the Texas question becomes front and center. Does the United States annex Texas, which will almost certainly lead to war with Mexico, or do we do nothing and let Texas deal with its own problems? The Whigs do not want to annex Texas. They don't want to go to war with Mexico. They don't want this conflict. We don't need it. Anti-slave activists don't want to annex Texas because we're introducing another slave state, right? Almost certainly we're introducing another slave state. And as big as Texas is, we could carve Texas into several states. We could have 2 or 3 or 4 slave states come out of Texas. And so absolutely not. Obviously, pro-slave activists wanted Texas. The Democrats want Texas. It is a hot-button political issue. and there are very firm opinions on either side. But the Democrats want it, the Whigs don't. Now, as an independent nation, Texas struggled. It had a bad economy. It suffered from terrible inflation. Other nations around the world really didn't work with Texas for obvious reasons. Every year, Texas appealed to be annexed by the USA. Every year, the Congress would not do it. If the U.S. were to annex Texas, would it annex Texas as federal territory, or would it annex Texas as a state? That's a legal question. Because if it annexes Texas as federal territory, then Congress has to deal with slavery, doesn't it? And the Missouri Compromise says no slavery in federal territory south of that line. And so that's going to be a legal conflict. Because we have slavery, but if it's federal territory, we can't have slavery there. But of course, if we annex Texas directly as a state, we're introducing the largest state in the nation, bigger than any other state, which sort of throws off all kinds of other balances that we're trying. And the issue sort of simmers in Congress, and everybody debates it. And in 1844, we have a presidential election. And Texas was the big question. It was the number one issue in the election. Do you support Texas or do you not support Texas? Are we going to annex Texas or not? The Democrats, who were strongly in favor of it, ended up running James K. Polk as their nominee. Polk was a former governor of Tennessee. He had also been the Speaker of the U.S. House. He had a pretty big political resume. And he was a protege of Andrew Jackson. He was nicknamed Young Hickory. And so he's the Jackson man. And Jackson is still alive in 1844 because killing Andrew Jackson is kind of hard to do. You know, God tried to kill Jackson several times, and he just obviously couldn't get the hint. The Whigs are going to run Henry Clay. We've mentioned old Henry Clay before, haven't we? You know, Henry Clay keeps popping up. He's run for president several times now. Henry Clay is very much against annexation. He doesn't want it, arguing it will lead to war with Mexico, which is unnecessary and quite possibly not winnable. It'll introduce all kinds of other political problems. We don't need the land. We don't need that headache. It's ridiculous. Polk is aggressively expansionist. Not only are we going to take Texas, but we're going to take land all the way to Pacific. Polk wants California. You know, Polk wants it all. So what are we going to do? Polk won the election of 1844 by a nose. It was the slimmest election we had had up to that point. Only a couple of thousand votes in New York meant the difference in the Electoral College. And there was a third party, the Liberty Party, which tended to take votes away from Henry Clay, so there was a third party spoiler. So that had something to do with it. But Polk was so aggressively expansionist that his party slogan was 54-40 or fight. Because Polk not only said, we're going to take Texas, we're going to take California, we're also going to take Oregon. All of the Oregon territory, we're also going to take. And if the British don't like that, we'll go to war with them. And 54-40 is the northern parallel of the Oregon territory. So we're taking it all or we're going to war with Britain. 54-40 or fight. So we're dealing with a very assertive, aggressive, expansionist policy. And of course, keep in mind here, Andrew Jackson was Polk's mentor. So you can figure out what that's all about. But Polk wins. That means we are going to annex Texas. The Texas question has now been answered. The Texas question is, we're going to take it. At the very end of John Tyler's term, right before John Tyler left, Congress passed an annexation bill. John Tyler signed it, and we officially annexed Texas as a state. Immediately, of course, Mexico declared that invalid and threatened war if we sent our army into Texas, insisting that Texas was still a Mexican state And for any American presence to be there, it would be an invasion. And there is even a dispute on what the border of Texas is. Is the southern border of Texas the Rio Grande River, or is it the Nueces River farther north? Because that had never actually been fully defined. And that would also determine, whether or not we had invaded. We insisted that the Texas border was farther south on the Rio Grande. Mexico insisted that it was farther north. And Mexico was actually probably right on that. The historic documents sort of support that, but that's not what matters here. Now, Polk doesn't necessarily want a war. I will let you know, I'll give you a spoiler alert, the 54-40 fight, the Oregon Territory, he negotiated that with Britain. We split it down the middle, and the border of Oregon today is the border that we negotiated. So half of the Oregon Territory went north, half of the Oregon Territory went south. We didn't want a war over it, and neither did the British. There we go. But what about Texas? And what Polk really wants is California, just to let you know. He wants all the way to the Pacific. That's what really is going on here. Secretly, Polk sent Santa Anna a message offering to buy the Southwest for $30 million. Not only does Mexico give us Texas without a fight, but all of the land to the Pacific, basically the modern border of the United States. Again, I'll put this here so you can see what I'm talking about. Polk sent a message offering resolution to Texas and all of that other land up there, $30 million, no fighting. Santa Anna rejected it. No deal. Polk then, in 1846, sent General Zachary Taylor into Texas with, of course, a regiment of American soldiers right along the Rio Grande. And for a few weeks, the Americans were right across the Mexican border. And of course, Zachary Taylor's secret orders were to find some way to get this party started. And there is a tremendous amount of tension and debate. Over in Europe, there's a huge debate going on, not only whether or not war between the U.S. and Mexico will happen, but who will win. And if you think to yourself, well, of course America will win. No, that doesn't, no. Don't think that. America doesn't have much of an army at all, and Santa Anna has a very skilled professional army that he's been training and equipping for years. On paper, the Mexican army is definitely superior to the American army at this point. Plus, if the United States goes to war with Mexico, we have to be on the offense. We have to have a war of aggression. Mexico just simply has to defend. So the European experts generally concluded that this was a really stupid idea of the United States. We can't beat General Santa Anna. He is the Napoleon of the West, and he had already proven that many times in the past. And his men were considered very skilled. Well, tell that to Zachary Taylor. Taylor was a old-fashioned, gritty, cigar-chomping general, a bad dude. You can tell just by the picture of him. This was him on a good day. We also had General Winfield Scott. Now, he had played a role in the Indian removals, but General Scott actually had a history going back to the War of 1812. He was an officer in the War of 1812, a West Point graduate, originally from Virginia, but now living in New York. Winfield Scott was known to be very talented and very capable. I'll just go ahead and get it going. In April of 1846, there was a border skirmish, almost certainly because the United States went into Mexican territory. Taylor sent some men in. The war now begins, and there is, and I can't show you here because I don't have a good map on it. I really should. Sorry about this. But the United States actually invaded Mexico from the north. General Zachary Taylor led the Americans in from Texas. And then we also launched an amphibious assault on Mexico, America's first amphibious invasion, down the Gulf of Mexico, and right here you can see it on the pointer. Y'all can't see it in the classroom. Just south of Mexico City, we invaded the city of Veracruz. And so 2 American armies went in. Whoops. 2 American armies went in. There were a whole series of battles that we fought. Up in north, for example, General Taylor fought the Mexicans at the Battle of Monterrey, which we ended up winning. It was a long, bloody, difficult battle. Kind of went both ways. Could have gone either way, but we ended up winning. Down south, General Scott defeated the Mexicans at the Battle of Cerro Gordo, and there were others as well. Eventually, General Scott surrounded Mexico City and laid siege to the city. And I'm really going fast here because I know we're almost out of time. And after a month of laying siege to Mexico City, the city capitulated and Mexico has been defeated. And so the United States invaded and conquered Mexico, and it was a very difficult war. Don't get me wrong. It was very hard. I've glossed over much of it. Much of the fighting took place, much of the fighting was done by American militia units. You know, it wasn't America's regular army that did the fighting. All of these volunteer militia groups were the ones that stepped up. And it's worth noting that the men that would later lead the armies during the Civil War, to a large extent, got their experience during the Mexican War. Jefferson Davis fought in the Mexican War. Braxton Bragg, Stonewall Jackson, all of these. George McClellan, the Union general, was an officer during the Mexican War. And most notably was Colonel Robert E. Lee, a West Point graduate who Winfield Scott thought very highly of. And when the war was over, Winfield Scott argued that it was Robert E. Lee that figured out how to take Mexico City. He was able to look at the Mexican defenses, and the city fell because of Robert E. Lee's own study of it. And so all of these Civil War generals cut their teeth during the Mexican War. So now that the war is over, the treaty ending the war was the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And in this treaty, again, we'll go back to this map, the United States received Texas, Mexico acknowledged it, and all of the land to California. All of that had been Mexico. Now that is all the United States. But the United States gave Mexico $15 million for it. Not as much as they could have gotten before. But we didn't just take it, we bought it. Now I'll ask you, before we go, why do you think we gave them anything? We fought this war, we won this war. The winners take what they want. Why did we pay them? What might be the motivation behind that? Well, I'm sorry, a little louder? I can't hear you. To prove a point? Well, you're kind of getting there, okay? Here's the thing, folks. Once you cash the check, you don't get to argue against the deal. If I say I want to buy something from you, and you take the money and cash the check, at that point the deal is done, isn't it? And so by paying them and them taking the money, they can't turn around later and say this isn't a deal we like. You see what I'm saying? That makes it kind of official. So it was understood. Also, it would show legitimacy in Europe. The European countries can now recognize that we've done this fair and square. But what really concerned Polk was that, I mentioned earlier, Santa Anna really has a very tenuous hold on Mexico. And Mexico has a tendency to go through dictators. And so by giving Santa Anna $15 million, he can then take that money and secure his authority in Mexico. And as long as Santa Anna is in charge, Mexico's not going to try to get any of it back. You see, if Santa Anna has just lost a major war, he is not a popular man. It would be very easy for another dictator to overthrow him. And if that happens, a new dictator may try to go to war again. And so this propped up Santa Anna's government and anchored this treaty and this agreement. And so it was considered money well spent, but needless to say, Mexico wasn't too happy about it. And so the Mexican War is over, and boy, we went through it quick. Okay, remember everybody, we have a quiz that opens today. It's due Sunday night. Participate in the discussions, and I will talk to y'all later.